All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2021 aid budget briefing. It used to be an aid budget breakfast, and now it's become a briefing, perhaps not as friendly, but it's certainly very efficient. I think we've had almost 400 people register, so we're looking forward to a good attendance today. We've already got 120 people online and counting. So welcome everyone. My name's Stephen Howes and I'm the Director of the Development Policy Centre here at the ANU. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the Australian National University sits, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So this is the time of year in which at our centre we do have a annual fundraising appeal. So if you value our work, if you like reading our blog, or if you find this kind of budget analysis useful, please do support us. Thank you to everyone who already is or has been a donor over the years. We do need that independent funding to keep going. And if you'd like to support us, the link is on the slides. You'll see that in a minute. And because it's through the Australian National University, it is tax deductible. Let's get going on this briefing. I want to, although I'll be presenting it, I do want to thank my colleagues at the centre. It is a team effort to bring this briefing to you, and I especially want to thank Sherman Surundaran, who worked long and late last night to do a lot of the graphs and also to update our aid tracker, which has now been updated with the latest information. I welcome your comments and questions, which you can submit through the chat function, which I'll check from time to time, and or through raising your hand. I know a lot of you will have questions about some of the detailed allocations in the budget that we may not have answers to. It is only a 4-page aid summary that we're provided with now. So I'm sorry if I can't answer all the questions that you have. We'll do our best. I guess the aim of this briefing is to provide an update, but also to provide context. And we try and share our analysis, not only the budget, but also of any kind of recent information that's related that's come out. The last one we had was just in October, and I'm not going to repeat some of the information there, especially on the broader. Last time we talked about the debt relief, which is of course a key topic in this COVID era, but I didn't feel there was much need to repeat that. So we're focusing this time in particular on aid. We try and provide a critique, but also the context. You can make up your own mind and you can go and look at the numbers for yourself on the aid tracker. All right, so let's get started now. And there's the link below. If you are able to support us, that'd be terrific. All right, so actually, I set up, because you're always thinking, what am I actually going to talk about? So before the budget, I set out these 3 tests, 3 questions, and I'm going to start with those. Then we're going to provide the broader budget context within which the aid budget was, has to be understood. Then some more specific aid updates, and then more specific still looking at aid and COVID-19. And finally, looking at our aid in a global context, because the OECD has actually just released its latest aid data, so we can do some interesting comparisons. So I set out these 3 questions or tests for the aid budget. And the first is whether the aid summary would actually provide estimates of total ODA. That's a very basic criterion, and you think obviously it would, but in fact, it didn't. And, I put this up as a question because it happened last year. Last year, the aid summary presented a total, and then it presented a another temporary measure, and you had to add the 2 together. And same approach was taken this year. There was some progress in that at least the temporary measures were broken down into the annual amount, so it was easier to add them together. But there's still no attempt to actually provide the total number, although there is a number called the total Australian aid. It's not actually the total Australian aid, it's the total aid, excluding those temporary measures that you have to add in. So it's quite a bizarre situation. It's obviously there for political reasons. The government doesn't want to focus on the fact that it has increased aid above 4 billion. And DFAT is going along with that. And while you can work it out together, it does have a cost. So for example, we can't really provide country information on ODA allocations because that supplementary, which is about 10%, is excluded from the country ODA estimates. And I think also there's a cost just to DFAT's credibility as the manager of the aid program. Second question, and from now on I am just going to add those two amounts together. We were thinking, the second question was whether there be any further increases in aid next year. So next year being the budget year 21-22. And in fact, what we saw was no further increases. There was one small initiative for India that was announced both for this year and the coming year. But in total terms, the budget's actually going to fall from what's now the estimate, which is 4.48 billion, which is this year's aid estimate based on this year's budget plus a few subsequent announcements that were made. It's actually slightly higher than we thought, about 4% higher, because the vaccine spending is more front-end loaded than government had earlier said. And of course, that's a good thing to get the vaccine out, but it does mean more money this year means less money next year, absent any new initiatives. And the economic response is also front-end loaded. It's 200 million this year, only 100 million next year. So actually you get this reduction. This is just in current prices. Once you add in inflation, it's a 5% reduction. And then the third question I posed was whether the aid increases would be sustained over the forward estimates. And we were provided with forward estimates for ODA, but the answer is they're not sustained. So even in nominal terms, you see a reduction in the forward estimates. And in real terms, that would be even more. I think it's a 12% reduction in real terms over the forward estimates. There is some reintroduction of indexation in the outer years of the forward estimates on that base amount, the 4 billion, but the temporary measures have all ceased by then. And so overall, even though indexation is resumed, you get this reduction in total ODA. So just stepping back from the sort of the budget period, looking at the aid trajectory under the coalition, this again is just in current prices. This is the red one is the last Labor budget, and since then a series of coalition budgets. And basically what you see is the big cuts around 2015-16, and since then aid sort of bumping along at around the same level. There was a pretty significant increase this year, the 2021. That's a 10% increase, but as you can see, it hasn't been sustained. And so when you step back, it looks more like noise than any attempt to actually put the aid program on a positive trajectory. Then stepping back even further, this is our full data series from the aid tracker going right back to the 60s. And now, over such a long period, we are adjusting for inflation. So everything is put in today's prices. And yeah, you basically see the scale up under Howard and then Rudd-Gillard, so now in a period of kind of stability and then a reduction. And we've had a couple of bumps along the way, but overall the trend is down. And when we adjust for GNI, for the size of the economy, this is the generosity index that is used all around the world and is kind of the official measure of the OECD. yeah, we're on a downward trend. Briefly, there is a brief improvement in the current year, but then it's down, and we actually estimate it falling to 0.18 over the forward estimates. You'll see these are slight. I'll come back to this at the end. These are slightly different to the numbers the OECD has because of a fiscal year, calendar year difference, but they're very small differences. All right, so that's I guess the answer to those three questions. It was none for three, so it was a disappointing budget night from that regard. I'll just go on before I see if there are any questions. I'll just talk a bit about the broader budget context within which the aid budget sits, although the aid budget is a very small, it's less than 1% of the total budget, but I think the total budget context does matter. This is the underlying fiscal position, or the deficit, the cash balance. Clearly we have gone into a large deficit, but it's actually, although you can't see it, it's actually smaller than was feared or projected at the last budget. I think it was $210 billion deficit, so it's only 160. So it's a much better position, and the government is projecting the deficit to fall, but it's not in a hurry to eliminate that deficit. So even at the end of the forward estimates, there's still a pretty significant deficit. And when we break that down into revenue and cash, you see why. I mean, expenditure does fall compared to, that is in 21-22, expenditure falls compared to 2021 with the winding back of the various support programs, but it doesn't fall back to its pre-COVID level of around 26% of GDP. Government projects that falling much more slowly. Whether it will or not is an interesting question. You can see there was that step up in expenditure at the time of the GFC of about 2 percentage points, and it never really went back to the pre-GFC level. So whether this might be another permanent step up, which needed to finance things like aged care and other sort of pressing domestic needs. I think that's one scenario. But from an aid point of view, the sort of more relaxed spending environment hasn't really helped. If we look at aid to total expenditure, we see that downward trajectory, briefly interrupted by the scale up, but now aid is less than 0.8%. So again, you see a little blip in the current year and actually next year because of the scaling back of the domestic support programs, but overall, it's on that downward trajectory. We always like to compare aid and defence. I guess it's just an interesting comparison for how it's changed over time, and it's about, in this budget, our estimate's about 10 times exactly. Defence is 10 times foreign aid, and it is on a upward trajectory. So we expect that multiple to increase over the forward estimates. All right, I'll just see if there, I'll just check for questions before I go on to the specifics. Yeah, that's right. Anthony Sevilla has a really good question, which I hope you can see, which is why the government sort of is focused on this 4 billion as the preferred amount. Is there something special about it? Yeah, that's a good question. Somehow it has assumed a special status. They have, in the outer years of the forward estimates, started indexing that again. So it's not as if it could never go above 4 billion, but they do want to see that. I think they want to present that as kind of the cap, and they're very keen still very keen to portray any increases as temporary, any increases above that as temporary. But yeah, it is an odd situation, and it does result in this these kind of bizarre contortions where you can't actually say how much aid you're planning to spend. Okay, so some more specifics about how the government is spending that money. I'll come to spending the budget. I'll come to COVID-19 a little bit later, but first, just some broad updates about geographical and sectoral trends to the extent that we're able to. Yeah, this is the Pacific Step Up. So this is the share of the aid program going to the Pacific, and I've also included Timor-Leste in there, since it is, de facto sort of part of this Step Up strategy. And yeah, you can see that is the major a major shift in the last 6-7 years. The increase in the share, it's a massive change, about 25% to above 40%. There's a slight dip. I think the last year is the budget year, 21-22, because that 200 million economic support in 2021 is being reduced to 100 million. So there's a slight dip, but overall you can see a massive shake-up in the aid program with that hugely increased concentration on the Pacific region. And if you just look at that year by year in terms of absolute funding, you can see all the other regions have gone down. East Asia's gone down. There's a slight recovery in East Asia because of COVID spending, and the new Southeast Asia initiative, which is welcome and significant, and at least a sign the government probably thinks it can't cut East Asia anymore. See, the rest of the world has really been paying the price for the increase in the Pacific, and aid to Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, South Asia, virtually eliminated. And then in terms of global programs, they've also had to be reduced to make way for this increased aid to the Pacific. But we did do this analysis just to look at how the Pacific Step Up has been funded, because remembering that aggregate aid has been reduced. So if all the shares were equal, then aid to the Pacific would have been reduced. So in fact, the increase in aid to the Pacific, right, although here it's shown as like $500 million, in fact it's more than that, because it should have actually fallen, right, if aid share was held constant. So the actual increase in aid to the Pacific is about 750 million in today's prices. About 300 million of that is financed by cutting aid to Sub-Saharan Africa, another 300 million by cutting aid to South Asia, and then another 100 million cutting aid to the Middle East. And the rest is really quite small. That's sort of the cuts to East Asia and to global programs. But it's mainly reduced aid to Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that we have used to channel that money into the Pacific. In terms of sectors, there was no sectoral information presented on budget night, either for the coming budget year or even for this year. In fact, there were no revised estimates for this year. So we're still working off budget estimates even for the total, but there was nothing at the sectoral level. So this sectoral analysis is a bit out of date, but I think is revealing. So these few graphs are presented as cuts. So the negative numbers are increases and the positive numbers are cuts. And so with the aid program being cut across the board, obviously most sectors have to fall, and that's what you saw happening. That's what you see from this graph, with the exceptions being agriculture that was protected and infrastructure. So this is sort of the aid for trade emphasis that the aid program has had in recent years. Interesting though, last year, so that's 2019-20, not surprisingly, we saw a massive increase in health spending, right? So everything else had to be cut to make way for this increase in health spending. So if we combine the earlier cuts with what happened in 2019-20, this is the overall picture. And you see, well, in fact, infrastructure and agriculture more or less held constant. Governance has been cut, but it's a massive sector. So proportionally, it's not a large cut. Where the cuts have really been felt is education, which is $500 million. So I think that is almost about half of the education spending has just been eliminated to finance the aggregate aid cuts. So health ends up being largely protected because it was cut, but then restored again. And then resilience is the other sector. So resilience is your humanitarian funding, but also sort of environmental and climate change funding had to be cut as well. And then there's this other general category that's hard to say much about. So yeah, the bottom line is that if you're thinking like where have these cuts over the last 6 or more years, I guess it's now since 6, 7, 8 years, where they come, where they've been concentrated, it's really education and resilience, I think is what I take away from all this. I just want to say something about humanitarian aid, because that's something where that is included in the budget. So most sectoral information isn't, but there is information on humanitarian aid. And we can track this every year. And I just want to point out this dip. I mean, the government has a 500 million target, is in the white paper. And in fact, aid is normally around 500, humanitarian aid. So this is aid for disaster relief mainly, is normally around 500 and above that if you adjust for inflation. So it wasn't really that demanding a target, but it has now fallen well below that. Now, the government represents this slightly differently. They include this thing called the COVID Response Fund, which is 50 million. And so that gets you closer to the 500 million target, although not actually to the target. So we've excluded that from this. And the reason for that is that, we're not denying that COVID is a crisis, right? Or that it could be counted as humanitarian aid, but we want to look at whether COVID is crowding out, the traditional humanitarian spending on crises. And if you start including COVID funding, then you're not going to be able to see that, whether you are getting that crowding out. And obviously, if you want to include COVID, you can include all of it, right? If it's a crisis, then all COVID spending should be included. So it doesn't seem to us to make much sense just to take 50 million and put it under humanitarian. So we've excluded that, and excluding that, you can see that humanitarian aid is slipped well below this 500 million target. And what that says is just that the government is, it is very difficult to respond to COVID without a bigger aid increase. And the price is being paid in crowding out of funding for what were really serious humanitarian crises before COVID, and which are more serious now because of COVID. And it's very notable, for example, that on budget night, government was unable to show any response to the African famine, apart from restoring a 10 million aid cut to the World Food Programme. So I think this is a significant finding. We always report on aid partners. Again, we don't have information for the current year or next year, but the actuals have been released for 2019-20. They don't show much of a change over the overall pattern, which is the shift since 2013 towards both the multilaterals and the commercial contractors. So whereas those two between them were responsible for about 50% of delivery of the aid program, it's now 2/3 of the aid program. So that again, I think is a very major shift. All right, I'll come back to aid and talk specifically around COVID shortly, but we also keep an eye on NGO aid. So I'm just going to include that right now at this point. This is based on ACFID tracking of NGOs. It does include a couple of large development NGOs that are not in ACFID. It only goes to 2018-19, but you can see this decline in aid ever since 2014-15. This is in public donations to NGOs. So this is not all NGO revenue, but this is their support from the public. We don't have aggregate data beyond that, but we did look at some of the annual reports of the major NGOs. and we found 7 have been published. So this is for 1920. Now this is, so this is only about 30%, I think, of the total that they come to, but they do all show a reduction in donations in 2019-20, and they're not all the same, but they're quite, the average is 12%. And even some of the NGOs that had been growing, like the Global Development Group, had been showing rapid growth, are now showing a reduction. So clearly, we'd expect 2019-20 to show a further reduction in public donations for development NGOs. I mean, that's not surprising just because of the disruption of last year. But I guess the question is whether that will be just a one-off fall and then donations will pick up again, or whether in fact, this will be a new base that NGOs will have to contend with. So I think that is a worrying trend that we just wanted to alert people to. All right, the next section is specifically on COVID-19. So before I get to that, there's a question. There are a few more questions. So Tess Newton-Kane's asking about how aid's been reallocated. There's no, because we don't have those sectoral estimates, we don't have specific information on those reallocations. So, and I'm also going to come to that a little bit later. So, but that's a good question. Eric is asking whether the global spending includes funding for the Pacific. My understanding is if it can be allocated to the Pacific, then it is. But if it's global, like core funding, then it's not allocated. So you're right, it is a somewhat artificial distinction, this one between the regions and the global, but it is the way it's presented. So it's the best data that we have for analysis. Lorenzo is asking about the World Food Programme increase, and we're only told it's a 10 million increase, or aid, I think, which is a reversal of last year's cut. So it's hard to know what, I don't know what exactly that's for. And Julian Newhouse is asking about gender equality. I'm going to come to the new initiatives. There was not a lot on gender or climate change or disability in the 4-page budget. So I think it would be, there has been, of course, the very important announcement about the Pacific Women Lead, which is sort of a continuation of the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Program. But I think it'd be hard to say there were any major shifts that I detected on budget night. Okay, so I'm going to go on now to look at specifically at COVID-19 and what were the new initiatives that were presented. And these are initiatives that have been presented basically since the last budget. So the only new one related to COVID-19, and in fact, possibly the only new one in the budget, was this response for India to assist with their humanitarian crisis. And that's 37 million over 2 years for India. The other initiatives mentioned here have all been, were announced either at the last budget night in October or late last year. So there's the economic support package for Pacific and Timor-Leste, which is 300 million in ODA, and that's over 2 years, that's 200 and 100. There's this vaccine access package for Pacific and Southeast Asia. That's 523 million over 3 years, and all of that is ODA. I mentioned the India response, and then there's the Southeast Asia enhanced partnerships announced last year by the Prime Minister late last year. I think that's very significant because that is the first sort of major initiative of support for Southeast Asia rather than the Pacific, and the reversal, first reversal of cuts to Southeast Asia. And I think, that it's perhaps a sign of things to come. It's 500 million over 4 years, not all of it's ODA, and I'm still not sure exactly how much is ODA. And it's not all implemented by DFAT, but the total amount is 500 million. Some of it's related to COVID, but I would say by no means all related to COVID. Some of it looks like fairly standard aid sort of projects related to infrastructure policy and planning, for example. Then there were other initiatives that were, some of these are new, some have been announced before. They're not ones that reflect new money. They're ones that are highlighted out of that out of the overall budget. So that they're not initiatives that have caused an increase in the aid budget. But there is support for the ASEAN Centre for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases. That's 21 million over 2 years. The Partnerships for Social Protection, that's been around for a while now, but that's 16 million. It's for the Pacific over 4 years. There's the Quad Vaccine Partnership. So this is the quadrilateral grouping with America, Japan, and India, which is 100 million over 2 years. And then Australia is also supporting the vaccine response through provision of vaccines that we're manufacturing. And interestingly, that's not costed. So I guess that could have been put in the ODA budget, but the government's decided not to. So it's listing that as something to bear in mind. So that's really sort of recap of budget and either new things in the budget or things that were highlighted in the budget. Just want to mention a couple of other facets from some of our research, more critical. One is this interesting finding about how spending slowed in the second half of last year. So when I'm talking then about the July to December period of last year. So if we look at the fiscal year, as I mentioned, there's actually an increase in aid, quite a significant increase, right, by 10%. But when we look at aid in a calendar year basis, and that's how the OECD reports aid. So we know Australia's aid on a calendar year basis by going to the OECD, we actually see that aid went down by 9%. So it's they're both quite large and they're in completely opposite directions. And it seems quite paradoxical. But the OECD does give an explanation for this, which obviously comes from Australia, because each country would explain it themselves. And it does say this is due to slowed spending as a result of the pandemic. And I think that is worth noting because it's, on the one hand, you can say, well, it was a very difficult time. It was a time of disruption. It's not surprising that spending slowed. A lot of expatriate aid workers had to leave the country. Aid projects couldn't be delivered as planned. So it's not surprising and perhaps justifiable. On the other hand, you could say, well, actually, this is a crisis. This is exactly when you do need aid money and when you should be getting aid money out the door. And Australia did reallocate funds, for example, to budget support, and perhaps it could have done that a lot more aggressively. Certainly when you look at other donors, you don't see overall aid went up in 2020 compared to 2019. So it doesn't seem that other countries had this problem of slowed spending as a result of the pandemic. When you look at the numbers, it looks more like a problem that was unique to Australia. And I think that does go to the question of DFAT's aid management. DFAT and the government was quick to bring out a new aid strategy in response to COVID, but perhaps that reflects the DFAT strengths in the area of strategy development, whereas this result on the ground speaks to weaknesses in DFAT around actual aid management and aid implementation. So I think this is a very significant result, and I hope there's more public discussion of why we were actually forced to slow aid spending just when it was needed as this crisis was unfolding. And the second little piece of information we wanted to alert you to is something called Act A, which is the which is an acronym that escapes me right now, but it's referred to as the accelerator, and it's the sort of global facility by which donations or contributions to the global COVID-19 response are tracked. And it includes governments, both from developed and developing countries, but it also actually includes foundations or companies. Anyone can donate to this. And so far, the amount that's been raised is 12.3 billion. But the contribution, that's in US dollars. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. But the contribution of Australia is 0.6, which is about $70 million. And that corresponds to our COVAX contribution for vaccines, which I think is about 80 or 90 million. So it's a very small response, and surprisingly small when you think about the 500 million that Australia has allocated for COVID vaccines. And it just speaks to the fact that we are, well, it speaks to two facts. One, that we're basically going it alone. We're taking a very bilateral response and working directly with countries in the region rather than going through global facilities such as COVAX, or working with organizations such as Gavi and the Global Fund. And so it speaks to that bilateral response, but it also speaks to basically the very small response that we've had so far to COVID, just the very limited amount of additional aid that we made available. When you compare what some other donors are putting on the table, Australia's amount does look very tiny indeed. We've always been a regional donor, but we've always taken a two-track approach. So we do still provide significant core funding contributions for multilaterals, such as the World Bank, Global Fund, and Gavi. And you wonder why it would be any different here. Normally our response would definitely be around the 1% to 2% range, not the 0.6. So I think this graph speaks to Australia's limited response, and also speaks to the pressure that Australia will come under in the coming months as an economy that is doing relatively well in response to COVID. And as, for example, Australia gets invited to the G7 and sits at the G7 table, I think this kind of comparison is going to be drawn, and Australia will come under a lot of pressure to contribute more to the global effort against COVID-19. All right, well, look, I'll just finish off and then I'll go back to any more questions. I just want to wrap up with the OECD data that got released last month. We did put out a blog on this on Monday, but in case you missed it, it does point a fairly depressing story of how Australia's aid effort has collapsed, relatively speaking. And the point I want to focus on is that our share of the global effort, we used to contribute 3.7%. We're now down at 1.6%. So it has more than halved. I think, there's been a lot of talk about the end of aid, and aid's no longer relevant, but that is very much an Australian view. In fact, worldwide, aid has contributed to increase, and it's increased since 2011 by about the same amount that aid in Australia has fallen. So we are sort of going it alone in our aid cuts. We're not reflecting some broader trend. And in fact, of all the DAC donors, our aid shows the biggest absolute decline. And if you look at in percentage terms, we've cut aid the most out of all the DAC donors with significant aid programs over this period. And if you look at other countries that are cutting aid, that have cut aid by a similar amount, the only other ones you find are the crisis countries of Europe, Portugal, Greece, and Spain. And they've obviously been in a very difficult position ever since the global financial crisis. But there we are along with them. And once you get beyond the crisis countries, there are only a few countries that cut aid, and it's by much less. So we do really stand out. All right, well, just to wrap it up, I think the last budget that we discussed in October and the subsequent announcements, they were steps forward. They were definitely steps forward, despite the transparency concerns around how they were reported. It was a 10% increase. But now with this budget, we've gone backwards again, in my view. But there is a hope for further announcements. I mean, I think we can have some hope that there will be further announcements in the course of the year. I don't think this budget will be the last word, as the COVID situation continues to evolve and not necessarily improve at a global and regional level. And as Australia comes under more pressure, I think both regionally and globally, to do more. So I think we shouldn't see this budget as the last word on Australia's response during this global pandemic. So thank you very much, everyone. Do check out our aid tracker, which we have now updated with the latest global and Australian aid data. And please do get back to us with any comments you have so that we can improve it further. That's it for the presentation. I know there are some more questions, and we've still got some time before we wrap up. I'm sure a lot of these I'm not going to be able to answer, but I'll do my best. So Joe Knight's asking whether the increase in climate fund is a return to the green climate fund, and I don't think there's any evidence of that. And in fact, I wouldn't say there was an increase in climate spending announced in this budget, but I guess there have been announcements through the year. But I'm sorry, I can't. Yeah, I haven't heard anything about us rejoining the Green Climate Fund. If I'd be interested, if anyone else has. Dane Moore from World Vision is asking. That's right. Yeah. So I think I agree with you, Dane, that it may be the government is planning to make further announcements during the year, as it did last year, perhaps in the run-up to the G7 meeting that it's been invited to. I think certainly that's, we have to hope that and have to keep working on that. Shoba is saying, what would be my vision for aid if this miracle increases and if there is an increase in aid? I think, I think aid will increase again because, that it is a very Australian view to think that aid is on this, inevitably on a downward trajectory. When we look around the world, we see quite a different story. And those countries that have cut aid, for example, the UK has cut aid, but it's still hitting the 0.7 target. So, I don't see this as a permanent situation, and it's if we look over time at the Australian aid budget, it's waxed and waned a lot, and I think it'd be a mistake to think that we're going to keep seeing the aid budget only being cut. It's a question on the intellectual property waiver of COVID vaccines, which is a very interesting question, but I'm not sure what the Australian government position is, so I can't answer that. Maybe I'll just focus on ones I can answer. Marion Stanton's asking whether this includes the contributions to Gavi and COVAX. So it includes contribution to COVAX. That's this ACT aid, the accelerated tracker. It includes all contributions that are specifically COVID related. Yeah. Yeah, well, I can answer this question, which is about the UK, and I think the UK, because it was in the UK budget cuts there in 2020, that is included in the in that OECD analysis. And yeah, the UK, I mean, its aid is so far above Australia's in absolute and relative terms that those aid cuts don't affect Australia's position. I mean, Australia's basically Australia's down the bottom of the pack. We're right down the bottom. In fact, according to the OECD, we're already in that 0.2% club, which only includes the US, which is of course the biggest donor, but the US is, I think, a special case. But apart from that, I think it's Portugal, and then it's all the new donors, who just recently started up their aid programs. Yeah, definitely the slides will be put up online today. We'll let you know about that. Amy is asking about reduced aid transparency and what are the implications. Yeah, there is reduced aid transparency. I think it's good that the DFAT still have a budget briefing. That's great, and it's good they provide forward estimates on aid. So there are still some strengths in the DFAT system, but definitely this shift to not preventing an aid total, I think is really unfortunate, and it does cascade down, as I said, to the country level. There is someone's asking about other government departments. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but that is, I think it's basically unchanged across the two budgets. I didn't notice any big change in other government departments. So yeah, in fact, it goes down slightly from 326 this year to 317 next year. So I think that was not, yeah, overall I think you could say there was not a lot of change in this budget compared to the previous budget and the announcements made at the end of last year. Perhaps that's, there just wasn't enough time, and perhaps it will come out through later announcements. Yes, on that point, I mean, Murray has a good point that there are 3 international events where Australia will be pressed to do more: G20, G7, and a European vaccine pledging meeting, which was launched by the USA. Are there any amounts in Australia's budget global allocations that might be hiding undeclared contribution to the ACTA? I don't think so, Murray, no, because we don't see, I just don't see the sort of the space for that in the budget. But there's nothing to stop the government making announcements and adding it into the aid program as it goes, and perhaps that suits the government better in this mode, that it really wants to make it clear that these announcements are, or these new initiatives are temporary ones. Yeah, I'll go to Janet Hunt, and then actually someone's raised their hand. Be good. Let's get a live question. But Janet's asked, was there any rationale for the big cut to the education sector? I don't think so, no. I think just something had to give. And first of all, it was health and education had to give to finance the aid for trade focus. But then, there had to be a very rapid reversal on the health front with the pandemic. And to its credit, the government did set up the Health Security Centre. So, I think it had already started to reverse those health cuts to some extent before the COVID pandemic, but then with the pandemic had to have a big reversal. And so that just left education as the main sector bearing the cuts. But yeah, I will highlight there were also those cuts into resilience and to a smaller extent to governance. So yeah, in a shrinking aid budget, if you want to put a focus on something, you've definitely got to make some big cuts in other areas. So, yeah, Dan, did you want to ask a question?
Okay, Stephen, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, what are the top 2 or 3 things you think the opposition would do if they were in power related to the aid budget?
Right. Well, I mean, last election, the opposition went in with a promise to increase aid, but they lost the election. And we know they're rethinking their policies. So whether they'll actually have that kind of policy, at least in a quantified way, remains to be seen. So I think we can't really answer that question yet. I'd say Labor has been very quiet on foreign aid since the election. Yeah, Richard.
Stephen?
Yeah.
Was there any implication for labour mobility initiatives in the budget, the aid budget?
I didn't focus on that, to be honest. So not that I'm aware of, but it could well be that that I'd mixed it, that I would just missed that.
Okay.
I'll just go to Fiona Ryan. She'd asked about the grant loan mix. So actually the Australian aid program is all grants, and there have been these significant loans to PNG and Indonesia in the last year. And because interest rates are so low, they are very cheap. And they're both quite significant, I think over $1 billion. So I think that's also, that is very significant as a non-aid response to COVID-19 crisis. And again, you'd probably expect there to be more aid, more loans required in the future, definitely for PNG, but I think quite possibly for Indonesia. And Greg Earl is asking about the quad response. Yeah, my understanding is that is part of that 523 million, Greg. So I think you're right there. I don't know if there's others on live, but I can just keep going with a few of these questions. Carl is asking about the 200 million program being fully delivered. Yeah, that's a really good question, Carl. And because we only have budget estimates for the current year, so that's all we can say is that the budget is there. But you're quite right. Like, it could be that it's going to be delayed and pushed into next year. In which case next year's aid might go up a bit. So yeah, that should be borne in mind, that even though this budget year is almost over, those estimates for this year are still based on, they're still budget estimates. They're not revised estimates. Fiona Tarpey's asking whether the cuts to education are mainly on scholarships or other parts of education. Yeah, they're across the board. I think scholarships have been cut, but it's by no means just scholarships. This is basic education funding that has been cut. There's a question from Lorenza. Oh, sorry, Lorenza Lazzato has raised a hand, so perhaps we'll go to Lorenza.
Hi, sorry, I raised it and I lowered it, but just a quick question. I missed the point about the NGO volunteer and community programs. Has there been any cut there again?
No, so that's, yeah, I think ACFID will be all over that, but my understanding is no, that's all been kept at the same level. So yeah, no cuts for the NGOs. Sarah Carter's making a good point here that she says the Labor Party did agree at the special conference platform on the 30th of March. It would again commit to increasing aid, but did not specify how much or what the targets were. Yeah, so thanks. That's a good clarification, and it will be interesting to see whether they do that. Yeah, Amanda Watson saying that that we only get 4 pages now. Was there more in the past? Yeah, there was definitely more in the past, and I mean, a lot of it was just kind of, I guess, glossy PR, but there were some interesting facts and figures in there. So you hope as the aid program moves on that we go back to more budget documentation. I think there is, I think you can sympathise that in this the very, very difficult situation, they have had to cut back on some of their transparency, and it's understandable that not all the information could be presented. It is a very fast-moving environment, difficult environment, but I hope going forward some of that other information can be restored. James Rock is asking about spending. Yeah, so we have spending up to 2019-20. That's been released by DFAT, but beyond that, it's only budget information. And in terms of outcomes, yeah, of course, that's critical. That's what it's all about. It's not what this presentation is about. We do this every year on the budget. But we do, try and analyse aid effectiveness through the year, through different research projects and blogs. So I certainly agree with you. You can't only focus on the numbers. You have to look at how that money is being spent. But I guess for today's presentation, it is about the numbers. Kishti is asking about spending on vaccines, and yeah, there is information on spending on vaccines in the Pacific, and I think but it's not in the budget actually. Yeah, I think it's around 70 million next year. Yeah, so regional information on these special initiatives is limited. But the main initiative across Pacific and South Asia is this 523 million initiative, right? And then in addition to that, there's the COVAX contribution, which is about, I think, 90 million now. So those are the two big vaccine initiatives that are contained in the budget. Yeah, Ismo's asking about international data on public donations to NGOs. Yeah, that's a good question. And I imagine it was disrupted in all countries. So I'm sure it's not just in Australia that public donations have gone down. And I do want to stress it's it could just be a disruption, a one-off blip, and we'll see a recovery next year. But it's certainly it's worrying, something to watch out for. Maybe I'll just finish on two more questions, two last questions. One is about from Leanne Pham about China-Australia tensions. Yeah, I think that is critical to understanding what the Pacific Step Up, that is very much driven by geopolitical competition with China. And also, if we look at the increase to Southeast Asia, right? Australia had been cutting aid to Southeast Asia to fund the Pacific Step Up, but it reversed that with the announcement, I think in December of last year. And although it was said that was related to COVID, a large part of that announcement really has nothing to do with COVID. It's more traditional aid and support. And so I think that is the realization that the strategic competition, we can't only focus on the Pacific, we need to also work more in Southeast Asia. And so that, can distort aid priorities. On the other hand, it can provide a basis for aid increases. So it's sort of I'd put it in the category of mixed blessing. And I'll just end with Dane's point about the Act A, the accelerator, and we're at 0.6%. What would be Australia's fair share? Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we'll do some work on that, Dane. But from what I remember, with you look at it like another multilateral, right? Like our contribution to the World Bank, or in general to Gavi, and I think it's normally, or our share in the global aid effort, and it's normally closer to 2%, certainly more than 1%. So it would be a much larger amount than the current 0.6. All right, well, we are out of time today. Sorry if I haven't got to everyone's question, but do feel free to email me, and happy to continue the discussion that way. Hope you found this useful, and as I said, we do need your support to continue, so do think about making a tax-deductible donation to the Development Policy Centre. But otherwise, thanks for taking part, and have a great day.